Hey, so this is Tyler with BikeRumor.com, and today we're talking with the whole crew over at Breezer Bikes, and it's a little bit smaller than you might guess these days, but they are focusing anew on kind of the gravel adventure segment with their bikes. And so today we have on the line Lena Cooper, who is the brand manager, Mark Vanek, the product manager, and the founder, Joe Breeze. So I think a good way for us to start is to have Joe kind of give us just a super brief history, that 2 minute run through, like how you got started and sort of the quick history of the brand. And then we can dive into some of the progression over the last few years of where the brand's gone and where it's headed.
So I got my start in the 70s, amid the bike boom, working in bike shops, then making my own road racing frames, custom-built road racing frames, and that from 1974. Albert Eisentraut taught me how to build frames at that time, and had been riding all over since I was a kid, all over California. Eventually raced road bikes all during the 1970s. Eventually at Category 1 level, and grew up in Marin County, just north of San Francisco, around Mount Tamalpais, and fell in with the fat tire crowd, or I was kind of an instigator of that, actually, with our Velo Club Tamalpais, with Gary Fisher and Charlie Kelly, etc., and that became our off-season cycling fun, and was there at the inception of the whole deal with the repack racing, kind of the crucible of mountain biking, forming in Marin County, and was elected to build the first modern mountain bikes built up with all brand new parts. First shiny new mountain bikes were Breezers. And actually won the first repack race I did on that bike. I had been racing the clunkers before that and winning, but my first ride was aboard that Breezer, and that was about 40 years ago to this day, either October or November 1977. And after winning the race, I had promised to make 10 frames, and all the ones that weren't sold were sold right then and there after I won that first race. It appeared that you could win on one of these bikes, and anyway, the first shiny new mountain bike right there, and which is in the Smithsonian today. But went on developing mountain bikes, was kind of known as a mountain bike guy, but my love in cycling is all things cycling, really, and really including transportation and getting where we need to go, getting help while we're doing it, saving ourselves time, keeping that smile on our face all day long, doing all different ways of cycling. And of course, adventure cycling is part of that too.
Yeah, so for some of our younger readers that aren't as familiar with the history, and to be honest, like I really didn't realize you had started with road. I just had always associated the Breezer brand with those steel hardtail mountain bikes from the early days. But what could you just explain in your own words, like what is a clunker and what was repack? Like why were some of those first mountain bike races with the legends called the repack?
Yeah, okay. So the clunker is what we call a clunker anyway. In this case, is a 1930s, 1940s, maybe 1950s old Schwinn balloon tire bicycle, kind of the ubiquitous of the day back then. And 30 years after kids were riding those bikes, we'd find them in the junkyards and repurpose them to ride down Mount Tam. And the first organized mountain bike racing was repack. It was a downhill, went down a spine of a ridge, 2 miles down a hill, 1,300 feet drop, 52 turns, really good test of a downhill to prove who was fastest, because hey, we were a bunch of competitive road racers, right? and just needed to know that kind of thing. Who was fastest? But anyway, that first race solved nothing because hey, if I hadn't fallen down or if I was there, I would have beat you. So there needed to be another race. And in fact, there were 24 of these repack races, mostly in the late 1970s, 76 to 79, pretty much. And the reason for the name is it's just a natural name because we started with the coaster brake hubs on those old clunkers, and they were not up to what we were dishing out going down that very steep hill. By the time you were halfway to the bottom, if you had looked back, you'd notice that you were being followed by a contrail of smoke, and by the time you get to the bottom, the darn thing's about on fire, and you'd have to go home and repack the hub with grease. Just a natural name.
So you basically got one run out of the bike before you had to rebuild the rear hub.
Well, okay, so there was the Bendix hub, maybe so, not so much with the Morrow hub, but yeah, in general, you had to repack your hub at some point.
That's pretty awesome. So from there, we fast forward a bit because what we really want to get to today is kind of where the brand is now and how you got there. You know, you did mountain bikes for a long time, but I remember, you know, even in the short time that we've had BikeRumor, which we turned 10 in 2018, that you know, those first few years of going to Interbike, and you guys had your booth. Your big focus was really on city bikes and transportation bikes.
Yeah.
So what was how long did you do that? Because that's still part of your line. But how did you go shift from mountain bikes to that as a focus?
Yeah, okay. So, well, of course, it started with the road bikes, then the mountain bikes, and by the time everybody was making mountain bikes in the 1990s, I figured I'd get back to one of the most important things to me, and that's just getting around on a bicycle. And heck, I guess I grew up with that idea. My dad used to ride his bike to work back in the 50s. He was in the automotive business. And so I just always had this view of cycling as being this very, wide bandwidth, and was always surprised how few people were doing it in that way. And when I took a trip through Europe in 1971, I not only was able to meet Chino Cinelli, the man himself, but in Holland I saw this fabulous infrastructure and adults getting around in their everyday lives, and thought we got to do this in America, and so that's been a focus of mine ever since then, even before road bikes and mountain bikes, and so in the 90s when everybody was making a mountain bike and recognizing that people were interested in getting where they needed to go in their busy lives, that I wanted to make a more practical bike for it. People were repurposing their mountain bikes to ride in the cities, in the towns, but it would be lovely to have a bicycle that was more like a car, that could carry things. When you parked it, it didn't fall over, maybe at night, maybe not even at night. You could have lights on your bike, fenders that you wouldn't get a stripe up your back, things that just made a bicycle more useful all day long. That became my focus. And in fact, I repurposed Breezer in the 2000s to be only transportation bikes, no mountain bikes, no recreational bikes, just so I could focus on it and really push that idea forward. And we were the only bike company in America focused 100% on transportation biking. When I sold the Breezer brand to advanced sports makers of Fuji, Kestrel, and SE bikes, etc., at that time, when you were brand new, I remember talking with you, Tyler, in 2008, that sale year for me, and that's great to hear that you're coming into your 10th year now.
Yeah, thanks. So so 2008 is when you sold. How did that affect your role in the company?
Well, now I do the part I love the most, which is bike designing.
Right on. And so are you designing every bike under the Breezer name?
No, and special projects, new ideas, things like that. I still have my my full machine shop, and I can work out ideas, prototypes, things like that, and contribute in that way.
Cool.
And do more of that.
So do you come up with ideas when you're tinkering in your shop and then pitch it to ASI, or do they come to you and say, hey, we think we need this to fit into your portfolio. What can you bring to the table?
Yeah, it works both ways, and I'm usually shooting ideas to Mark Vanek, our production manager, and run the stuff by him, and he runs stuff by me, and so we just work together on where this whole bike thing is going.
Right on. And you had, a few years ago, you guys came out with some full suspension mountain bikes, but then it seems like pretty quickly the focus was off of that and back onto some of the city bikes, and now in the last maybe year and a half, 2 years, toward the burgeoning gravel adventure bike scene.
Yeah. I was very happy with our mountain bikes. And really, it's Mark Vanek who came up with more of the guy who came up with the gravel bike thing, the adventure bike thing, and I'm just really impressed with the work he's done, putting together our three models, radar, Doppler, and inversion lines of adventure bikes, and so that's largely Mark who's pushing that, but it's a delightful thing for me to see, because that was one of my early interests in bikes, is just be able to get around in so many different terrains on a real versatile bike like that. So it seems to be a good direction of ours now. We still do a whole lot with bike transportation bikes, fully equipped bikes for every day. But that's a fun avenue that we're going down right now.
Yeah. So Mark, maybe you can chime in on the decision to do these kind of gravel adventure bikes. What was the impetus, and how long did you guys start working on those before they actually came out?
So the first, model year of the inversion, which is the highest end kind of a gravel or all-road bike that we do, that came out for this last model year, 2017, but kind of started on that the year and a half before that. Kind of the background of all of that was, going all the way back, on my side, getting into cycling, I came from the opposite direction of Joe. I started mountain biking first in the early 90s, and then got into road riding or training, primarily because I started racing mountain bikes, and I got into my first expert race, and getting my rear handed to me by all the really fast expert racers, and talking to them afterwards and learning a lot of guys were training on the road. So I started road riding, primarily just to train for longer mountain bike events. And at that time, I was living in Central California, which, if anyone's familiar or has driven through California, the Central Valley, it's super flat, and there is a huge network of irrigation canal systems. And it made it fun, as a mountain biker, where if I had to, bear it and sit on a road bike for a bunch of hours, I could at least go ride in the dirt on all the canal paths and kind of crisscross all the sloughs and gullies and stuff in the Central Valley while I was training for mountain bike events.
What year was that?
Fast forward, that started early 90s, so maybe 93, 92.
So way before the current
this
gravel explosion we're seeing.
Yeah. At that time it was just kind of, we were just, riding. Yeah, there wasn't, anything. It was, cyclocross at that time, for sure. Cyclocross predated all of that. But for myself, I was a teenage kid. I could barely afford a mountain bike, so I really didn't have the ability to get a quiver of bikes or training on. So I had a hand-me-down road bike that I just tried to make work in as many different terrains as possible. And fast forwarding, as I got into the bike industry, I just, like most people in the bike industry, they just love bikes in general and ride any kind of bike I can, whether it's road, cross, downhill, or just traditional mountain biking. Getting into Breezer, it was kind of really interesting and enlightening meeting Joe, and In particular, going to visit Joe at the museum one year before Sea Otter at the Marin Bicycle Museum in Fairfax there, and seeing like one of his early road bikes. Because I also had no idea that he started on with some of the road bikes. I only knew of Joe from the mountain bike side of things as well. And it's interesting, like you see some of the older road events, and the tires that were used on some of those bikes where they had to go across mixed terrain. They were definitely doing gravel a long time ago. And then you have some of Joe's colleagues like Charlie Cunningham doing like the CC Proto, which is a bike that kind of predates a lot of modern bikes in terms of having like a compact geometry and one by drivetrain, a makeshift clutch derailleur, like all sorts of really cool things. So I guess kind of having my upbringing of riding a lot of different terrain with the goal of making mountain biking more enjoyable for myself and being more competitive, it kind of transformed my road riding into an activity where I could try to be, I could ride on any kind of terrain possible. So when Joe and I started working together, the gravel bike, that idea, there were already bikes out there in the market, but our goal was, I guess to kind of make that road bike for mountain bikers, and it was a bike where, it was fully capable of logging in a lot of road miles. You could sit in on a weeknight, practice criterium or whatever to do your speed work, but it had the legs and the tire clearance to go off road if you wanted. And then working with Joe, there was like this huge well of knowledge on the tubing design, geometry, structure, all this stuff that kind of Joe has worked on, the last 4+ decades, to kind of make that first project, I guess the inversion kind of come to life. And then I guess it kind of had some of its younger siblings, the Radar, which is a bike that has a little more tire clearance, kind of more geared towards a rider that's going to spend more time off-road than on. And then new for 2018 is the Doppler series, which is kind of, I guess people still call it a gravel style bike, but really it's almost kind of more of a rando flavor bike where it's got 650B wheels and designed to be a bike that's going to spend a lot of time on just really bad roads for a long period of time.
What year did you join Breezer?
So I started actually with ASI. That was in 2014. I took a kind of a opening position working on components. Before that, I was working in California on bikes for the 13 years before that. I started working with Joe, got in late, I guess, 2015. So pretty new relationship still.
Yeah, so that's pretty quick to come up with 3 different models, because it's not like you said, you didn't come up with them all at once. It was the inversion and then the Radar and then the Doppler. So, for what, 2.5 years here, it's you guys have come up with 3 pretty distinct models. Is that how much were you guys hustling to make that happen? Because it seems like to me, I guess maybe with carbon more so, but it seems like the normal development cycle for a brand new bike is 1.5, 2 years.
Yeah. Well, part of it was, I think, Joe and I think probably melded pretty well together with a lot of kind of ideas, or I guess values in bikes. And Joe's kind of he's a pretty dedicated person in design work. We've definitely had a lot of, a couple calls that went into midnight of designing stuff. It was funny. Yeah. I think, Joe, you're very much a night person, not a morning person, it seems like. And it's funny because, I used to I was in Marin County as well before I started with ASI Advanced Sports. I lived maybe 3 miles north of Joe, and then I moved across the country, and then a year later started working with Joe again, located back in California, so it's kind of funny. But I think maybe that background kind of helped us, make up a lot of ground really quickly, as we both kind of rode the same area, the same terrain, kind of had the same viewpoint on a lot of stuff. So that, I think, made things click really quickly. and of course, Joe has so much design background. I did product management before, so I had, good understanding of product and construction and all of that. But yeah, I think just kind of the combination of being in the same area, riding in the same area, and having kind of a similar, I guess, eye towards the horizon. It really helped us kind of make a few bikes really quickly, because we didn't really need a lot of development time. It just kind of was there for us.
Yeah. So ASI is based where? East Coast?
Yeah, East Coast. So we're in Northeast Philly. So I moved out into the country northeast of Northeast Philly to be out in the woods, to have as close of my own little Marin County as possible that I left behind.
Right on. So what I've noticed with mountain bikes is, outside of the massive global brands like, Trek, Specialized, Giant and stuff, is when you start getting to the mid-sized brands and especially the smaller ones, like when you kind of get to that Santa Cruz level or Niner and then on down to like Evil and some of those brands, is that the bikes and the geometry and the suspension, the bottom bracket height, all this stuff really seem to be tailored to that company's home terrain. And so I'm kind of curious if you guys have noticed that, but B, like, how does that translate for gravel? Because, if you and Joe both grew up kind of riding the stuff around Marin in that area, and that was who you're used to, was it, do you find that, with your gravel and off-road road bikes, do they really perform well for that terrain, but maybe don't translate as well to East Coast terrain, or how do you deal with that?
Well, I mean, with I would say kind of all three platforms, it's a pretty universal geometry. They aren't so much designed to be kind of I guess like if we talk about the inversion first, that's a bike that's got a pretty a pretty decent like BB drop to it, so it's a kind of a nice stable low center of gravity on that bike. So it's designed not so much as like a technical like single track ripper that's going over logs, things like that, where you're trying to avoid pedal strikes or chainring strikes. It's a bike that's designed to be really stable, where if you're hauling through like kind of a downhill section on gravel, it's a really predictable ride, and you've got a really nice low center of gravity on a bike, so it's stable, and you can kind of help steer that bike with a little bit of counter steering and a little hip input versus having to actually like turn a bar and potentially fold the front wheel underneath you. I guess in the different areas where I've lived in California, where again, growing up like in the Central Valley, and then also living in the way northeast corner of the state, and then in Marin County, that always kind of translated in a similar way, whether it was riding on a flat canal bank in outside of Fresno, or bombing something, like hitting like Bolinas Ridge or something like that out in Marin.
So maybe ask that slightly different way. Like, I mean, obviously you're going to be a little bit biased because you're working for the brand, but when you go ride those bikes out in California, do they feel like they're performing more in their element or less in their element than when you ride them back at home?
Yeah, for me, I feel like I don't. I mean, out here in Pennsylvania, there's actually a pretty large population of kind of dirt roads and really bad farm roads. So yeah, I don't really see that kind of translate the same. Like on the mountain bike side, like some of the bike packing stuff we do, like the Lightning, the Steel Hardtail. I mean, that's a bike where it definitely had a lot of kind of influence from Joe's philosophy of mountain biking, and definitely being that kind of Marin County geometry where you're dealing with like, tight trails, lots of switchbacks, things like that, where, I mean, it's a hardtail, let's say like you took that down to Southern California and you were trying to bomb like a really rutted fire road, definitely would feel different, right? I mean, you kind of saw that, like if you thought about like bikes in the 90s where you looked at early, you'd probably, if you were looked at like the old school GTs where they were 70 degree head tube angle where everyone else was 71 and steeper, that was definitely like a territory thing or a turf thing where those were bikes where they were hitting really fast fire roads down there and wanted a little more front center measurement and a little more stability versus guys up north that wanted a little more agility in the tight stuff where if it was like muddy conditions.
Yeah. So for your line, for the inversion radar Doppler stuff, like what do you guys do to kind of set your bikes apart? Like what makes them special or different than the other gravel and adventure bikes on the market?
Well, probably Joe and I can each answer that with our kind of own thoughts on it. I mean, for me, with the inversion, like I was kind of blown away when I started working with Joe on just his like knowledge of like steel tubing and tube forming, and just like little things of like where he's placing the tubes in conjunction to like the head tube, of like where the tubes are perched in relationship to the edges of the head tube themselves, and being super critical of those measurements, or the chain stays at the bottom bracket junction. Everyone's trying to kind of optimize frames, but also, we're also trying to make bikes that we can kind of reliably make in volumes, and sometimes, especially if it goes to overseas manufacturing, making sure they can be done reliably. It was really kind of interesting and awakening working with Joe on the inversion project and the Lightning project, because there was a lot of kind of really painstaking details that we needed to put into both those bikes to make them right, and to also make sure that they were kind of built the way that he was building bikes in his workshop.
Just to jump in on something about my interest in structure on a bicycle. I just, over all my years of designing frames, one of the things I focus on is how to get as much tubing as possible into a frame, or that is, how to reduce the joinery to its bare minimum, because really tubing is the star of the show. That's what's giving us a lively feeling bicycle, one that feels like a spring, and doesn't have that dead feel like a lot of frames do, and that's by just making sure that that joinery is reduced to its absolute minimum, so you can have that cool tubular stuff in there, as much of it as possible. And so that's always the challenge is to make that come across in production too.
Yeah, and I guess an example with that would be like on the inversion, that Joe had done. Joe helped, created the breeze-in dropout, right? Everyone's kind of, I imagine a lot of people are familiar with the shape of that dropout on,
the hooded dropout, where you have a real good contact from the chainstay to the rear axle, and it's like half the weight and twice the stiffness as the old conventional door hinge dropout. Just a big swinging gate there at the end of the chainstay.
Right. Yeah, like that the dropout was kind of one thing in particular of a bit of a challenge, or definitely a bit of a focal point, was making the inversion with a through axle rear end. And usually, what I'd seen in the past with a lot of builders was, you kind of either make like a CNC dropout that has kind of some length to it that would incorporate the brake mount and the dropout, for the through axle altogether, which was something, Joe kind of enlightened me on, like altogether, of trying to have, eliminate an area like that, like a CNC area, to make sure there was as much tubing length as possible, to make sure, again, to help make sure the ride quality was as dialed as possible, and make sure that the dropouts were as compact as possible.
Yeah, when you're talking about like really fine tuning the meeting place of, like, say, the top tube onto the head tube and stuff like that, is that how hard is that to translate into mass production? Like, do you end up specifying a certain amount of variance?
That's hard right there. You're just trying to get the top and down tubes as far apart from each other as possible on the head tube, so you increase your perch. That's what we call our max perch, because if you have the top and down tube really close together, it's like a pivot point there, and that big cantilevered beam called a fork is like wearing on that joint right there. And so if you can make that perch as wide as possible, it's gonna strengthen the frame dramatically.
Well, so then you just try and put a really tall or taller than normal head tube on?
No, no. Well, all I'm saying is per head tube length, by having the perch of the top tube and down tube as far apart as possible, you're ahead of the game.
Gotcha.
And of course, with some big wheel bikes and long travel bikes, that head tube is going to have to be pretty darn short. But if you can maximize the perch, that's what you want to do.
Joe, I'm kind of curious, like when you sold the company and in the 9.5, 10 years since, is it, and I'm kind of asking like not just your take on your company, but when you've seen other people, Gary Fisher sold to Trek and Keith Bontrager sold to Trek, and I'm sure there's other examples out there I'm completely mind blanking on. But is it, first of all, do you care about maintaining the spirit of the brand once you've been paid and you're out? But is it hard to kind of keep your personality in the brand once it's owned by a larger company?
Sure. Yeah, no, I'm always hoping to put my indelible fingerprint on the machine. And yeah, it's I'll be honest, it's a challenge. But it's a bigger production, and I keep working at it and making sure things aren't getting lost in the translation and things like that. That's just going to be only natural. So I'm still engaged with it and still making the good fight.
Yeah. Was that did you negotiate to stay involved, or did they negotiate to keep you involved?
Oh no, they were quite happy to keep me on board and keep the continuity of my ideas with the project. Yeah.
ASI is a lot smaller of an operation than a lot of people think. So, in terms of sort of keeping Joe really involved in this brand and keeping the spirit behind it of what Joe built and that whole thing, we've recently sort of had more opportunity to work closer with Joe, and I have, just in terms of an internal restructure and assigning a brand manager towards Joe for the brand. So having a team of Mark with product and me doing the brand, it gives me the opportunity to work with Joe more than I think we have in the past, and to really try and reinvigorate the brand with that original essence that Joe brought on, and that he really built the company after.
Right on. So were you guys without a brand manager for a while?
We more just had sort of general marketing managers. No one was specifically dedicated to Breezer except for Mark on the product end.
Joe, what was your motivation to sell the brand?
Well, with being always such a small company and having a limited amount of impact from it, with the transportation bike market expanding in this country, here I was as this kind of this voice, saying, hey, we could expand cycling 10 times by putting biking more on the order of eating and drinking. It becomes more a need instead of a want. We all need to get health. We all need to get places. With the extraordinary efficiencies of the bicycle, you could do those things and even save yourself time. And then with more bike companies focusing on transportation biking, I felt it was time to kick that up to the next level, and so I wanted to partner with a larger company to have more impact in those regards and get more everyday bicycles out there, and then be able to do more than that too. Start to do the mountain bikes again, start to do recreational bikes again, and focus on those markets too. So that's why I work together with Advanced Sports.
Gravel and adventure bikes are kind of what you guys are pushing the hardest at the moment, but you still got the full line of city bikes. So where are you guys headed? Like, what's next? What are we going to see in 5 years from Breezer?
Yeah, I mean, we're kind of, I mean, it's it's trying to be solid with, I guess, kind of what the offerings we have now, but, making sure whatever's coming out is still kind of true to the Breezer name. And like you say, like making sure it's a bike that, has kind of a fingerprint of Joe on it. So probably no downhill bikes in 5 years, but, we'll see what else.
I would say we're definitely going to try and continue with the idea of bikes for your everyday adventure. So I would say continuing to expand the trekking and commuter lines, continuing to expand the adventure series. And by adventure series, I don't mean just gravel bikes. It could be a hardtail adventure type bike. It could be something a little more on the road side, sort of just focusing on having a robust line of bikes that you really can find something in Breezer to do and go on any adventure that you would want to do via bike.
Right. Maybe even with a little assist.
Huh. Yeah. There's a lot of attention on the e-bike market for sure.
We do currently have one e-bike in the U.S. and 2 in Europe under the Breezer name. They're not a huge part of our line, but it's not really something you can ignore at this point in the industry.
And those are in the commuter, kind of city bike line, right?
Yes, those are part of our commuter line.
Yeah. So where do you guys see that growth coming in the U.S.? Or I should say where, but how quickly? Europe is huge and it's everywhere. I mean, across road and, not road so much, mountain and commuter, and there are e-road bikes over there, which I just don't understand at all. How long do you guys see before the U.S. market is, a little more open to it and then a little more saturated?
Well, I think for the everyday getting around, e-bikes is going to be the next big thing. And it's already here in Marin County. You see them all over the place, and you see the gears turning and the light bulbs going on, and it's going to be a huge market. As far as off-road goes, well, I guess we need to sort out a few of the land management issues, or we need to make sure that a whole lot of people have worked very hard for trail access over the years, and we don't want to see that just compromised by poor planning on our part. So once we get better planning in place and we have our territory set aside for use of these vehicles off-road, then so much the better.
Well, on that note, if there's anything else you guys want to add about, kind of Breezer's current state and where you're headed, then go for it. Otherwise, it's a great spot to finish on, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I think, we kind of got a new little team formed, and, the goal is just to make bikes that kind of everyone enjoys. When I started riding, I couldn't afford, a custom bike or something of the stature of kind of Joe's original design. So when he kind of turned to make bikes that were really focused on the greater population of riders around the world, whether it was transportation or mountain, that was something that really kind of struck a chord with me when I joined the company, because I remember I bought a hardtail mountain bike without a suspension for it because I couldn't afford it at that time, and rode my bike to a summer job every day to afford a RockShox, and put it on my bike at a race at Big Bear, and was super happy about that. And it's really a gift now, I guess, to be able to work with Joe and kind of have all of those years of background and kind of ideas with him, and be able to kind of make bikes that are kind of for everyday style riders that have, I think, kind of the design background and kind of look to them that are reminiscent of what Joe did in his first days of doing hand-built frames in his workshop below his house.
Well, I really like the quote Joe had earlier, or maybe it was you, is that basically the bikes you're building now, those three, the inversion, radar, and Doppler, they're really road bikes for mountain bikers, and that kind of sums it up, really, what we're doing. It's like, all the bikes of all kinds, even if we're a mountain biker or a roadie, the tech and the designs on all the different genres are still interesting to us. And so when you can kind of get one bike that sort of crosses those bridges really easily, it's just fun.
Yeah, exactly.
So the whole idea is to get more people on bikes more often, and really dig in one of humankind's most marvelous inventions.
Yeah, awesome. Well, thank you all very much for your time. It was great talking with you.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you.